Hello and welcome to Owlbutcast. Now, it's not the one we talked about. We were going to do something on strikes this week, and this is why Albert's not here, because he was away doing his homework so as we could tell you why people go on strike, what the laws are about strikes, all of those sorts of things. But we've decided to change because there's been so much talk in the last few days about the government and what it's doing and U-turns and such. So I thought, let's talk about that. Albert isn't here, we'll be back next week. So let's have a look at things. Okay, are you ready? Because it's a bumpy ride. When Liz Truss became Prime Minister on the 6th of September, the first thing she did was to appoint a cabinet. Now the cabinet, and there's usually around 22, 23 people in the cabinet, it depends on each Prime Minister, but they look after various departments of government, like education, like health, like the Foreign Office, which looks after foreign affairs, or the Home Office, which looks after home affairs. Department of Work and Pensions looks after, you'll never guess, yes, work and pensions. They're very well named. Anyhow, she appoints ministers, and those ministers essentially run those departments. The minister who's in charge of how much tax we pay and how we budget everything is called the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And Liz Truss appointed a man called Kwasi Kwarteng to be that Chancellor. And then she and he got together, in fact they may have got together sometime before, and said, this is how we're going to solve the crisis that is affecting living standards, everything else in the United Kingdom. Their plan was to go for growth. So the economy of the country would grow. Now, to do that, they decided on a particular plan. And Mr. Kwasi Kwarteng announced the plan, the economic plan that the government would have and how they would deal with everything. It wasn't a tremendous success. He decided, along with Liz Truss, that they would reduce tax for the highest earners, that they would reduce income tax for everybody else from next April. They also introduced an energy guarantee plan whereby the price of energy would only rise to a certain level, and that plan would operate for 2 years. And there were a few other things that they decided to do. Anyhow, what happened then was that virtually everybody who had anything to do with money disliked it. And that's a polite way of saying they thought it was terrible. Now, in order to run the government collects money in taxes from you and me, possibly not you because you may be a bit young, and they also borrow money. Now, the people who invest in the government, the people who lend the government this money are banks, insurance companies, pension funds, investment funds, and none of them liked what Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss had done, because they said quite simply, you are saying you're going to do all this, it's going to cost, I think, £45 billion, and you haven't told us how you're going to pay for it. Now, again, normally when a budget comes about, there is an independent organisation called the OBR, which is the Office for Budget Responsibility. Don't worry, you'll never get asked a question on it. And they normally look at it all and say, yeah, here are the figures, this is what we've done, and it looks as though it nearly adds up. This time, they decided, Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, that they hadn't time to ask the OBR for their report, so they just announced it. It meant that in the week, or less probably, in the few days after the announcement, the pound began to fall in value, and the Bank of England had to step in to stop the British economy, in fact, collapsing. Pretty bad. A week later, Kwasi Kwarteng said, okay, we made a mistake. We are not going to cut the highest rate of income tax. We will leave that, it's 45p in the pound. So over a certain amount of money, every pound you earn, the government takes 45p in tax. The idea was to drop it down to 40p in tax, which doesn't sound much to you and me, but if you're earning £500,000 a year, it does make quite a big difference. Why you would need it, I have no idea, because I've never earned anything like that. Anyway, so they said, we won't do that. And all the bankers and the Bank of England, possibly the Bank of England, but the investment funds, the hedge funds, all of those looked at it and said, that's not going to make much difference. And the collapse of the pound continued. We now come to Thursday last week. Kwasi Kwarteng flew to America, probably in a plane, although maybe he thought he could do without, but I don't know. But he flew to America to meet other chancellors or economic ministers or whatever you like to call them, finance ministers, and also the International Monetary Fund, known as the IMF, if you ever hear IMF mentioned. Now the International Monetary Fund is what it says. It's an international monetary fund. It is sometimes been known to bail out countries who have actually run out of money. Greece, some time ago, maybe 14 years ago, I'm not quite sure the exact date, and I think maybe Italy had some problems. But it's quite often third world countries. The International Monetary Fund didn't like what Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss had done either. So he was over there and he got a message, come home. And it was from the Prime Minister. It was a very abrupt message, I'm quite sure. So he climbed on a plane, having discovered he couldn't fly, and flew home and met Liz Truss, I think. He might not have met her. But anyway, the gist of it, they talked. And she said, you're the reason this has all gone wrong. I know it's my idea, but you were the one that talked about it. So I'm afraid, would you mind moving aside? She obviously hoped he would probably say, yes, I know it's my fault, I'm going to resign, but he didn't. He said he would step aside. So he stepped aside, and Liz Truss then had to find another chancellor. His name, Jeremy Hunt. Now, he'd actually run for the leadership himself and had scored the lowest score of anybody, lowest votes of anybody, in the first ballot. He only got 17 votes out of a possible 300 and something. So he wasn't doing very well. He didn't do very well. Not very popular. So she appointed him as Chancellor, and they had a few chats over the weekend. And then on Monday morning, yesterday, he made a little 5-minute statement probably on TikTok, I don't know, it might have been on Instagram or something like that. But anyway, he made a little statement in which the gist of what he said was everything that Liz and Kwasi said they would do, we're not going to do. I'm reversing it all. No reduction in standard rate of income tax. The energy price cap will not last for 2 years. It will only last till April. And anything that hadn't begun to become law, he scrapped. Now, Kwasi's little idea was going to cost £45 billion. Not something that you or I can help out on to any meaningful level anyway. So £45 billion, by the time Jeremy Hunt had had his changes, he'd reduced that by £32 billion. So I think even if you don't understand economics, you will have worked out we're now looking at £13 billion that has to be found to pay for all of these things that they're trying to do. It means that the Prime Minister has, in roughly 29 days, changed everything that she said she was going to do when she was running for the leadership. Almost everything. And the latest is, just to let you know how topical this is, announced about 15 minutes ago, there is something called a triple lock, which applies to pensions. It also applies to benefit, as I said. And yet last week, Liz Truss committed to that for pensioners. Very nice of her. Today, that commitment's gone. There's no commitment that that will happen. I'm a little concerned that I don't see why pensioners like myself are any more special than families struggling to bring up their children, feed their children, and why it wasn't committed that benefits should rise as well. If you need benefits, you need benefits. But anyway, never mind any of that. So now, and the reason I'm doing this, I'm always doing this live, by the way, because it's now about 5:15 and this will be on the site by 6 o'clock. Sometimes you make me laugh, Richard. I know. It might be on the site by 6 o'clock, but one of the reasons was it's changing so rapidly. I just needed to make sure that I wasn't going to talk to you and the Prime Minister had gone. The Conservative Party MPs cannot actually get rid of her at the moment. She gets a year before they can have a vote of no confidence in her, unless they change the rules, or, as I think happened in the case of Theresa May, the chairman of the backbench committee, backbench Tories, people who aren't in government, it's called the 1922 committee because it was set up, I think, in 1923 or 1921. Anyway, it wasn't set up in 1922. And his name is Sir Graham Brady, if you hear that mentioned. He can go to the Prime Minister and say, look, nobody wants you. And it would be then sensible if she stood aside. But that would mean we would have 3 Prime Ministers in the same year. I'm not sure that that's ever happened. It has happened with kings, William the Conqueror, Harold and Edward the Confessor, 1066, or 1936, when we had George V, Edward VIII and George VI, all in one year. Edward VIII actually abdicated, and there are some people who think that perhaps that's what Theresa May should do. I'm sorry if I've rushed this, but there was a lot to try and tell you in 10 minutes. And next week we will talk about strikes, and one of the reasons we're going to talk about strikes, kids, is because another thing I learned today is that the NAHT, which is a teachers' union, I think it's the NAHT, if it's got another letter in there I do apologise, has voted to hold a ballot to see if they want to go on strike, or to see if they want to take action before striking, which in my day was called something called a work to rule, which is basically where you do no overtime, you do just what your contract says and nothing more. So, next week's strikes, Albert back. Hope you have a nice whatever you're going to have. It's Tuesday, so you do what you like. And I'll see you next week. Now the weather. Oh no, sorry, wrong programme. See ya.